Welcome to In Collaboration With, a conversation series from the teaching cooperative Writing Collab about craft, culture, publishing, and community. I'm Brian Gresko here in my studio in Brooklyn, and today I'm talking with Julie Buntin. Julie's debut novel, Marlena, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize and longlisted for the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, among many other accolades, including appearing on numerous Best Book of the Year lists. Julie's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, and the New York Times, among other publications. She is an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. Previously, she's taught at NYU, Columbia University, and other places. Julie and I first met at Catapult, where she was an editor and also the director of Catapult's writing programs. And she was a wonderful mentor to me as an educator, and these days, as I run Writing Collabs programs, a model of how an administrator should be.
Oh,
Julie,
sorry.
Julie's new novel, Famous Men, which is incredible, is just out from Random House. The book follows Wilhelmina Miles from a challenging life as a teenager in the Midwest to New York City, where she studies and has a complicated relationship with a famous writer named Nathaniel Fellows. Today, we will be having a mostly spoiler-free discussion of that book and Julie's journey to publishing it. Hi, Julie. Welcome.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. I loved your intro. I couldn't resist interrupting you. I was so touched. So thank you. Uh,
Let's talk about Famous Men. And let's start at the beginning. How and when did this book start for you?
yeah, I started this book in the summer of 2019. So like 2 years after Marlena. I had been writing something else actually. I've been working on another novel, but it was kind of rough going, and I had applied to McDowell, the McDowell Colony Writers Residency with that novel in progress. And I got there in the summer of 2019 and just was like really struggling to write it. I think I was feeling like a lot of things that people feel after a first book, and Marlena had like met the world in a way that was sort of like unexpectedly positive in some ways. Like it got nice reviews, it sold all right. Like I had this sense of like, okay, I've debuted and it like went it like I have living my dream, and now I have to follow up on that, and it has to be, it has to exceed the prom. I just was in my head about a lot of things that aren't really actually about writing and are really about like ego and careerist stuff and all these things that were not like things filling me up as a writer, but really things that were kind of external to that. So I got to McDowell and I was struggling to write. And it was my first time ever doing a residency in my life, which also I think added to the pressure. Like, I don't know if have you done residencies before?
I've only done one, partly just because for so many years I was a stay-at-home dad and it
Yeah.
just was
Yeah.
challenging to get away.
Yeah, I had such yeah, now that I'm a parent, I'm like it's impossible. But I had also had these intense jobs, so I was always writing around a job, and I just like wasn't able to take 3 weeks, 4 weeks off. But because of the book and because I worked at a place like Catapult, I was able to take an unpaid leave and go, and I just felt like, oh, I don't want to waste this opportunity. Like this is my chance to figure this book out. And I would get up every day in my studio and just feel feelings I'm sure people who are listening to this have felt. I'm just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't do it. This isn't fun. I'm a fake. I wrote one book. That was a great experience. Too bad I'll never be able to write another one again. I was really in it. And I found in my studio in the midst of this like horrible self-hating writer's block, a copy of Philip Roth's novel Zuckerman Unbound. It was just like in the desk drawer. It wasn't something I had sought out. It was just there. And I read it. I had never read it. I've read other things by Philip Roth and liked him, but I'd never read that. And I just had one of those like fun reading experiences where you're totally like absorbed in a text and hours go by. I think I like skipped a meal. It got dark. And I just felt this sense of like, I just thought it was funny. It was sort of embarrassing and cringy, but also really like honest and energetic. I think that energy was the thing I was responding to most of all. And I think really like this this feeling of a writer who had like broken through something and was in a space of like freedom, which was the exact opposite of how I felt. Like I felt like the least free. I was like choked by my own shit, which is thematically kind of in line with Zuckerman. Anyway, so I was sort of like doused in that sensibility and my studio had this giant window that was like overlooking the woods and there was no curtain. And I had felt in that studio a little bit of discomfort about that fact, actually, like a sense of like being able to be seen when, especially at night, like a sense that people could see in, but I couldn't see out with the light on. Like just that feeling, I think a lot of women are familiar with of like, do I need to be aware of who might see me or if do I have enough privacy here? And it wasn't like a high level anxiety, but it was just sort of like a prickle. And there was some kind of weird thing about the combination of like reading that particular book and then like looking out the window at my studio and wondering who might be out there and this kind of like weigh those two things, like the image of the window, the text itself, something about the male gaze and what that was bringing up for me with that particular book and that particular arrangement of my studio that gave me this weird like knot of tension or friction in my imagination that like I really do think of as the beginning of the book. Like I suddenly was able to sort of like turn back to the pages that I was stuck in, kind of airlift a character out of that. And then like I sort of had this sense that those tensions were the tensions I wanted to like smush her around in. And it was sort of from there that I sort of was off to the races. Like I think that night I wrote a lot. By the next day, I had settled on a kind of like plot oriented question around like Will wondering who her father is and not knowing the answer to that question and what that might set her towards. And I think by the end of the week, I had written like 60 pages or something. And so the book really started there again with this idea of like a question or a contradiction in the world that I can't quite resolve. So like a weird combination of like an influence and an image and almost like some memories from my own life. It's sort of a tricky answer because it's not straightforward. And in some ways I think it's like a hard sell for explaining where a book comes from, but it's sort of the truest answer that I have. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah, that's kind of that's where it came from. It took me 6 years to finish it after that, but that's where it started.
The truth is complicated, and I prefer it that way. So yeah, that's so interesting and interesting to think about that window and
Hmm.
Will's window when she's a teenager as well,
Yeah.
and the literal gaze that window brings.
Yeah, I really did like bring that image and that kind of fear wound up becoming like a real present activated element of the story. This question of like, is someone watching Will kind of wound into the story in a really active way.
What you brought up about Will's not knowing her biological father, and then as a teen, she's having a tough time in high school, she's having a tough time at home, and she learns that she can find companionship in books and release through writing. And so she begins to fantasize that her dad might be Nathaniel Fellows since he came from her hometown and knew her mother, and he's this famous writer. And as you know, I also grew up not knowing my biological father, and I had similar wonders when I was Will's age. You wrote about not knowing your biological father as a youth in Michelle Philgate's wonderful anthology, What My Father and I Don't Talk About. How did having insight into that aspect of Will's character affect how you wrote or thought about her?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I've done a few interviews about this book and no one's asked me that yet. I maybe because they don't know the way that you do that I grew up without my dad in my life. I mean, I don't know if you felt like this about kind of growing up with that question sort of looming over your childhood and adolescence, but I think I was interested in like the ways that not knowing the answer to a question like that can turn somebody into like a little bit of like a seeker. I think there's like a way if you don't know, if you don't know the answer to a foundational question about yourself, some part of you is always trying to find it, right? Like I think that's whether you try to find it through writing or you try to find it actually. I think there's something, I'm not going to say that like everyone who doesn't know something about their parents becomes a writer, but I think it's actually like a pretty writerly like like a precondition for like writing as a tendency because your imagination is immediately turned on to like, well, if it could it be this thing? Could it be this thing? Why don't I know? You're tuned into like secrets and omissions and like you start to have encouragement from the gaps in your own story to make things up that could explain it. And that's all, those are all kind of like writerly things. And I think maybe speaking personally, I think it's part of perhaps why I do this. I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons why I do this, but I think that might be one like habit of mine that started really young of like asking questions and not understanding the answers and wanting to know and fleshing out the story. And that particular kind of absence in my life, I had such different relationships to it at different points in my child. Like when I was a young child, it was such a fact of life. I almost didn't think, I was just like, oh, I don't have a dad the way that like the sun is in the sky. Like it wasn't like actually that it took a little while for it to become this bigger thing. And I was always sort of inventing stories about it. Like there was a time when I was very young when I thought that maybe Batman was my dad because because of like a couple things, like they're the letters of their first names are the same. I was like, oh, maybe that's why he's not here because he's Batman. Like that really would explain a lot of things, right? When I was like 6, 5. And then of course there's all of the like the ways those kind of questions sort of looking back on that, it's sort of embarrassing, it's sort of funny. So I think that was an area from my own life that I felt like I could understand in a really essential way what that might make a character kind of go after and how that might shape her decision making. And I think I was interested in things like just exploring in a kind of fictional context, like what does it mean to not have any sort of like male, this isn't even necessarily true to my life, but it's true to Will's life. Like what does it mean to have no kind of adult male figure that is like trustworthy to you or like stable or safe? And like how might that complicate what you accept later or who you look to for that safety? And that, when I was kind of starting to circle some questions about complicity and victimhood and trauma, like those things, that felt very interesting to me. Like, how much agency would a character think that they had? What are the times or spaces where like relationships kind of like overflow one category and fall into another? So I realize I've moved away a little bit from your initial question, but I think I was definitely drawing from some personal experience and finding that the kind of stuff that brought up for me could be activated in interesting ways in the plot, kind of like towards the questions I wanted the book to ask, I guess, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Yeah, Batman is so interesting to me also because Batman himself as a character is a seeker and an
Yeah.
orphan, a seeker
Yeah.
of justice.
Yeah.
I was a Star Wars kid, so for me, there was also this sense of what I was told was essentially like, it's not important. Like, just don't worry about it. And me and my mom, who's my biological mom, I lived with and grew up with, and my adoptive dad were so uncomfortable and were just like, we just never talked about it. They were so uncomfortable telling me about it. And we never talked about it. And so for me, that question was always that kind of Star Wars like question of like Luke not knowing his dad and the dad's who your dad is affects who you will
Who
be
you will be. Yeah.
and what is inside of you. And so absolutely that really resonates with me with that idea of like seeking. When I was a teenager, for me it was seeking in, I think, like especially the modernists who were,
Yeah.
like we're gonna, become expats, we're going to say no to kind
Mhm.
of this conventional post-war life and like make our own wild art life
Yeah.
in Paris. I, was obsessed with like Henry Miller and Anna East Nin and I think from in my own life, not to go down a personal route, but just I think similar to those things you're talking about with that when you're lacking a certain kind of role model, you can develop maladaptive strategies, as my
Yeah.
therapist would say, where, like you say, like you're not sure like how to relate sometimes to certain types of people, or you're not sure because you yourself are kind of have that kind of question mark in you. You have that kind of hunger, that kind of hunger for experience, hunger to try to figure out maybe this is me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think like I was interested in the idea that Will might not like that she is from a place where, there are not a lot of people who do this thing that she has become interested in, except this one person who also, for different sort of reasons, could be also the answer to this other question that she has. And definitely this idea that when thinking about some of the other things the book is getting into around kind of class and privilege of like who gets to be a writer, what kind of like background do you need, what kind of training do you need, and this idea that's really compelling to her that maybe she gets to do it because she's like destined in some way, and if she isn't, then what will she do to kind of make that happen for herself. But yeah, like I that all of that stuff resonant, that Star Wars kind of question of like who do you how do you know who you are if you don't know where you come from, or what kind of answer might this tell you about who you are inside? That is all and remains quite interesting to me about this. And I in my essay for Michelle's thing, I talked a little bit about kind of the weirdness of like finally finding that person and realizing that like who you are, it's not up to anybody but you, right? But it like takes you a long time to realize that sometimes when you have this like secret question about something like who your parents are. Yeah, I found all of that to be really fraught, and I definitely do draw. I have a complicated relationship to saying this because I resent when people make too many assumptions about the sort of autobiography of the fiction that I write, but I do at the same time draw from life in different ways and tend to try to like solve problems in the fiction if there's some kind of material that I know. I do find myself sort of drawn to like messing with that or playing with that in some way. And I think that the kind of father thread in this book is definitely one of those things.
Yeah, and I'm always sensitive about asking questions like that because of that. Because if a I know from my own practice, even if a writer is going to write about their life, they can choose to do so in
Yeah.
creative nonfiction, and even autofiction is
Yeah.
gone through the fabulistic processes that
Yeah.
happen when you're writing fiction, that no matter how much it seems like the author is presenting themselves as this narrator or character in a novel, it is never any sort of one-to-one kind of relationship.
Yeah, and in a funny way, that's also a part of what this book is about, the kind of like relationship between life and fiction. And like, there's definitely parts of this book that are where Will and Nathaniel are kind of like working those ideas out between each other. So I'm interested in all of that too.
Can you tell me a bit about how Nathaniel developed for you as a character? I feel like I don't know a single person that I'm like, oh, that's a Nathaniel Fellows. And yet at the same time, I feel like I know a lot of Nathaniel Fellows types.
Uh-huh. That's actually a great I'm glad to hear you say that like that. I was very, very obsessive and careful about making sure that no one could read this and be like, this is X person. Um, for obvious reasons. I will just say that Nathaniel is a composite, and I he's a composite of a lot of things of like I was reading a lot of things. I was reading a lot of like biographies of writers. I was thinking about my own kind of coming of age as an artist and different teachers I've had. I was thinking about sort of literary figures and their sort of macro influence on literary culture, and maybe even like me as a young reader, what that might have been like for Will. So he came from a kind of a lot of different places. And I think one thing that was interesting and challenging about him is that I think like a lot of teachers that I have known, and even I don't even need to say it like that, like even like I do this, I think as a teacher, right? We all have to have I think one of the ways you survive as a teacher over the long haul is by developing a little bit of a persona, like a teaching persona that you can like slip into that's like it more or less authentic depending on the teacher, but it's a little bit of a performance, right? And so one thing about Nathaniel that was interesting and fun to write and kind of hard is that he himself plays to the type that he is. Like he knows that he's playing to a type a little bit and he kind of like owns that. It's part of his persona as a teacher, even a writer in the world. But I also want him to feel like a three-dimensional character. I want him to be, I wanted at least, and I think different readers will have different takes on whether or not I was successful in this. I want him to feel charismatic enough that you're interested in what he will say or what he's doing in scene. I didn't want him to be simplistically villainous, if that makes sense. Like I needed the reader, I hope the reader can understand why Will gets herself into this mess, even if they can't relate to like some of her, her kind of desperation for a certain kind of relationship or stability. So I was thinking about all of those things and kind of like any character, I think there's like this funny thing that happens. I'm sure you've heard people say, like, I don't know, my characters, they just like make the decisions and then I just like follow where they go. And I always sort of resent that as a way of describing how a character works because there is no such thing as like a character making a decision. Like you make the decision as the writer and you are in control of that even when you feel like you are not. But there is a thing I think that happens to put a finer point on defining how that works, where you have made enough decisions about how a character functions over time in the context of a story that you've accrued a sense of personality that feels like it has its own life. Like, because I've made 52 other decisions about him, I know that the remaining decisions available to me in any given scene moving forward are only 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. And he definitely, after working on this book for like 6 years, I felt like with him, especially, and in some ways, Will was trickier in this way that I just knew him like so well. Like I knew what he was gonna say. I knew how he felt about things. I understood his voice. And that almost felt like it was coming from outside of me, but it really was the product of just kind of being with him for so long and thinking so much about what he would be like in those contexts and to Will.
Thank you for saying that. I'm so glad to hear it because I do sometimes hear writers talk about the characters speaking to them in a way that almost sounds like a seance is
I
happening,
know. Yeah.
another voice is coming in, and it can lead me to have a sense of lack where I'm like, oh, I'm not properly channeling.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can't write fiction because I don't hear it like that. And yet at the same, what you just described really resonates, which is more of like you create this relationship over time in your imagination with this figure that, and as time goes on and you get to know them more, like you said, then their choices and their patterns become more apparent and when they're going to break them and all that. And yet at the same time, you, the author, are always in control in that. It's not like someone's taking your hand and writing themselves.
Yeah, yeah. I've thought about that a lot because it's like I've felt compelled to say that before. Like I felt compelled to say that when people have asked me questions about how characters have come to be in my work, and I had to kind of stop myself and because it's an easy answer and it feels true enough. Like if you're working on a draft, it feels like at a certain point, if you're really in the kind of book, there can be a place, and I aspire to get to this with every draft where you're just kind of like not turned on, like that the part of your brain that is like strategic and craft oriented and interested in technique is not on. It's just something else is happening. That's the best place to be as a writer. But to get there, for me at least, is really hard. And there's so many things that go into that. And I think like I'm a teacher. That's mainly what I feel like I do that more than I write at this point. So I have to try to ask myself, like, hold on, what are we saying when we give this kind of advice? What do we really mean? What does this actually feel like? Like, how can I explain this in a more concrete way so that people who are trying to figure out how this works don't feel defeated when they're like, wait, I didn't hear the voice of my character because you probably haven't quite, you haven't made all the decisions you need to get them to be the specific person that they are. But if you can do that, then I do think you can get to that space. But there's more to it than that, I feel like. It's hard to talk about craft or even it's not even like the right word. It's just hard to talk about how this happens, like how you go from a few words on a page to like something that lives in somebody else's imagination.
Yes, there is a kind of magic that happens. There's this kind of relationship, right? That I think Alexander Chee writes about really well in on Becoming an American Writer at the end of How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, that this sense that if you're doing it well, you feel the author's mind behind the text, and yet this thing that's happening, like in any relationship, even a friendship, even in a romantic relationship, this other thing is being created between the two of you. The writer's words are going out, your memories are meeting the writer's words, and this new thing that's unique to that relationship is being born and being created in your imagination. It's really powerful.
Yeah. I love that. And I think that's exactly right. Like at the end, the thing that you want to have made is not just the finished book, it's the thing that exists in that like third space or something between you and the reader and the kind of intersection of the two.
Talk to me about community. I'm one of those writers who goes right to the acknowledgments
Yeah.
before I read the book, and I see so many names here. Um, how did community support you during the years that it took to write Famous Men?
That's such a great question. And again, like it's not a question I don't think anybody's asked me that yet. But I know you of all people will get this. Like the longer that I do this, the more like certain I am that the only reason to do this is to be in community with other writers and to be in conversation with other writers. Like I think there was a time earlier in my life as a writer where like I thought the book itself, like the end product of the book itself was like the ultimate thing. And actually that kind of question of like what writing is for and who it's for and some of the ethics of that is also baked into Famous Men, and Nathaniel would have a really different answer to this than what I'm giving you. But I just feel like I the rewards of this are the work itself. And people always say that like the reward is the work itself and the pleasure you take in the work and the things the work does to how you experience the world, the layers, the deeper layers of like access that you can get to your own mind and to, you know, the world around you. That's all part of it. But the other like huge reward is just like this conversation that I get to have with you, the conversations that I get to have with my students, the ways that those conversations add to the text that I read, the conversations I get to have with the writers that I read, like the ways that that conversation kind of leaks back into my work and the way that I hope my work like puts things back out into that conversation. Like that to me is the whole thing. I often have this moment with my students in the MFA program at Michigan where, you know, they want to get published so badly and I want that for them and they do and they will and that is I get that and I wanted that too so much as an I'm not knocking that is like I get it. It changes your life to publish a book. But sometimes I like want to remind them that actually the gift is the thing that we're doing right now. It's like coming together in the workshop actually and like if the workshop can be a space that is productive, supportive, rigorous, engaging and not destructive, we could have a whole other conversation about how those can go. But you know, the spaces we try to create at Michigan, like and that we try to create at Catapult and that you create in your workshops and that most of my colleagues and friends are making in their communities, like that's being part of that. That's it. Like that I think is the thing. I do really feel like that. So I I just feel such like gratitude. I mean, there's so many like corny things I could say, like this community saved my life. It like gives me, it's the whole thing for me. And it's funny, like Famous Men is a book that actually takes aim in some ways at communities of writers that are not supportive and that can be destructive. And I think that that's real. And I've swam through some of those spaces too, which only makes me kind of more grateful now for communities that people take great care to make like inclusive and supportive for all writers and all different kinds of voices. I mean, yeah, I feel like I could go on and on about this, but the writing group that I had while I was working on this book, like I would never have finished it if it weren't for those people. My partner is a writer. And like you know, I'm like very, very much in this world. And to me, that really is like kind of it's the gift of getting to do this work, I think.
Thank you so much. Your warmth and your wisdom comes through. I feel like your students are so lucky to have you.
Oh, thanks,
Um,
Brian. I feel like that about your students.
Oh, thank you. And we are so lucky to have famous men, and we haven't even scratched the surface. There's so much rich material here. So if you have not checked it out, please do. I'm going to drop a link in the show description so you can find it. It's such a moving and important book. In Collaboration With is brought to you by the Teaching Cooperative Writing Collab, an artist-owned and run organization which provides online classes, workshops, accountability groups, and other community programs. Fall classes are now available with offerings for writers of fiction, creative nonfiction, poetry, and translation. Find us at writingcollab.com. That's writingco-lab.com to learn more and subscribe to our newsletter. You can also find us on Substack and Instagram, and that is where you can find Julie Buntin as well. I'm Brian Gresko, sending creative vibes your way. Thanks for listening.